Down the rabbit hole, research rabbit holes.
Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of Research Rabbit Holes. Today is a very special episode because I actually have two guests today whom I met at the Memory Studies Association's conference in Prague last year. Welcome Dr. Jenny Kidd and Dr. Bethan, Beth Jones. Before we start with the interview, I would like to introduce you to my listeners. So, Jenny, you are a researcher at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University. Yes. You have a background as a web designer and a developer, and a PhD in digital storytelling, which sounds super cool. And your research interests include digital culture, immersive media, and digital creativity. Welcome.
Yes, that's me. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And Beth, you are also a researcher at Cardiff University. Your PhD thesis has a wonderful name, which I want to share with our listeners. It is called Fandom is Beautiful, Except When It Isn't, Hate, Dislike, and Toxicity Online. And your research interests include fandom, anti-fandom, participatory culture, screen tourism, and true crime fandom. Also, super interesting combination. Welcome to my podcast.
Thank you.
And the two of you are part of a research project which is called Synthetic Pasts with your third member, Dr. Ivanito McAvoy. And so the first question I wanted to ask you is, how did you actually get to know each other and how did you come up with the idea for your shared project?
Okay, so myself and Ava have been working together for a number of years. She joined Cardiff University for a period as a researcher on the AHRC Policy and Evidence Centre for the Creative Industries. So we were working quite closely there on a number of projects looking at largely looking at how museums and heritage sites were using emerging technologies. So we were talking a lot at that time about immersive media, so extended reality, virtual reality, augmented reality. We were talking about NFTs. This was a few years ago. So we were talking a lot about NFTs and we were talking lots about social media and all the rest of it. We had some projects up and running on all of that. And then the COVID-19 pandemic hit and a lot of that work that we were doing with institutions around immersive media kind of fell over. And we were sitting at home kind of twiddling our thumbs and thinking about what we could research whilst we couldn't get together and be researching in the same place. And we stumbled across some interesting stuff online, and this was the deep nostalgia kind of boom coming out of MyHeritage, which maybe we'll talk a little bit more about. But our move into looking at deep nostalgia and what was happening there, these quirky little videos that we were finding online, kind of led us to thinking more about synthetic media and how synthetic media were kind of changing, how we were interacting with the past. So this was all the way back in 2021. Bethan and I had been working together for a number of years. Bethan had done her PhD at Cardiff University in the school. And as we got the Synthetic Past project up and running, Bethan came to join us then as a researcher on the project. Bethan, do you want to say anything about all of that?
I was just going to say you were my second supervisor on my PhD.
I was.
So yeah, you were. So I've known Jen for a while, and after I got my PhD, I started as a research associate at the University of York, doing stuff on like skills and training in the screen industries. But when I saw the advert for the Synthetic Past project, I was really, really interested because it kind of tied in with a lot of stuff that I'm interested in, and also Jenny's lovely, and I was like, yes, I would love to work with Jen again.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, the project itself is basically about how fragments from the past, so for example, photos or audio recordings of deceased relatives, for example, how these are remediated and animated through the algorithmic systems, and with what consequences for how we remember and commemorate. And you already mentioned this so-called deep nostalgia tool by MyHeritage. So with this tool, you can animate your old family photos, I had never heard of this before, but apparently it's super popular because you wrote on your website that I think 30 million people had used that, right?
Yeah, well, just in the first couple of weeks. So it was launched in 2021, and within a couple of weeks, 30 million people had used it. I think it's something like 120 million people now, maybe more. Within a couple of weeks, there were 30 million of these recreations kind of doing the rounds on social media, because that was the kind of encouragement, was that you would reanimate people from your personal archives, your ancestors, and you would kind of send them out on social media. It was a big kind of marketing campaign really for MyHeritage, which was the genealogy company that was using the tool. But yeah, I think now it's something like 120 million plus users of this little widget. So it has proved to be very, very popular, and it went very viral at the time on Twitter and Facebook. And we really hadn't seen anything like it, I don't think, before. It's become quite, the norm now to see these, kind of AI sloppy kind of bits of content doing the rounds on social media. But at the time, it was very unusual. And so we kind of stopped in our tracks, Ava and I, and we were looking at these and thinking about how kind of creepy they were, but also how fascinating they were in terms of kind of memory and what these little videos might do to our memories of ancestors. And so we thought, yeah, we would study them in a little bit more detail.
I see. Yeah, and you also have a video on your website that talks about this tool, and I think Eva talked about wanting to animate a photo of her grandmother. But then she had doubts about it because her grandmother, since she was deceased, could not give her consent to Eva using that tool on this old photo. And so I wondered, do these 30 or, well, more million people who animate photos of their ancestors not have second thoughts about it? And is there any rule or guideline on the consent of these people whose photos people animate?
Yeah, so, and spoiler alert, Ava still hasn't animated her grandmother. And in fact, I think it led to a quite lengthy discussion in her family about whether she should and who she might need to speak to in order to kind of get permissions, if you like, in place from the family for her to do it. So, yeah, consent when it comes to these kinds of technologies, which kind of connect with what might be called the digital afterlife industry. So a kind of, broader industry that provides all of these sorts of, bits of kit that allow you to do this kind of work of revival. And all the time we're using our air quotes and using these terms. In those kind of contexts, consent is really a tricky issue, and at best understood in very kind of, superficial terms. Of course, there's no real mechanism for the person who is being recreated in this system to grant informed or ongoing permission in order for somebody to upload them in this way. And the idea is that users are uploading relatives' images, and in doing so, they kind of give a kind of proxy consent to the system. But it's not person level consent at the level of that person, and of course it can't be because that person is deceased. So the kind of technology assumes that families have the capacity to give consent, and that kind of permission is in place then when they upload the data to the site. And that's, we would say, I think that's ethically quite weak as a kind of consent mechanism. And all of the time with these systems, what they do is they push questions of consent and ethics onto users of the systems. And largely the systems themselves, if you look at their terms and conditions and their privacy policies and all of the rest of it, there's a big kind of gap there between the kind of legal terms and what we might consider a kind of broader, ethical notion of consent related to dignity, care, respect, and, all the rest of it. So the terms of service tend to do quite a poor job, really, of registering the kind of emotional dimensions of these technologies and the kind of mnemonic ones that we're interested in around memory. They tend to be much more interested, of course, because they, these systems and services are interested in their own longevity and viability, but they tend to be much more interested in the kind of legal defensibility question than they are in consent. But yeah, it's really challenging because I guess when it comes to true consent in the orbit of these practices, that would require pre-mortem kind of opt-in to the use of these systems, or they would rely on us to have quite clearly articulated wishes about our own digital legacies. And that's not something that routinely we tend to have in place at the moment, but perhaps we'll see more discussion about all of that going forward. But yeah, consent is obviously a really kind of knotty issue when it comes to these systems.
So when you upload something to the website, do they basically own your data that you just uploaded and they could just do whatever they want to and like use it for anything?
So they don't own it. You still own it, but it's complicated because they are also connected very often, these systems, with other third-party services. So, for example, they might use Stable Diffusion, or they might use Amazon systems or whatever else, where actually those kind of it all gets quite messy. So the idea is that you maintain that ownership, but if you kind of follow the threads, it does get a little bit murkier.
Now, out of this very large number of photos that were uploaded and videos that were created on this platform, how do you actually choose which ones you look at more closely for your research?
So what we did in kind of, technical operational terms was we used a hashtag as our way into our data sample. So we used the hashtag deep nostalgia. And we basically scraped everything. We were working with Twitter, or X, but Twitter at the time. We were working with Twitter data. So we scraped, I think it was something like 7,000 tweets that were all using that hashtag. And when you shared a recreation from the MyHeritage tool, the Deep Nostalgia tool, via Twitter or Facebook, where you could also share these things, they would encourage you to use the hashtag deep nostalgia. So we used that hashtag as a way of kind of finding our sample, and then we did a very kind of broad kind of quantitative analysis of that, and then we kind of honed in on a kind of smaller subset in order to look at in a bit more detail and do a kind of more focused thematic analysis. But I guess when it comes to kind of like specific images or videos, we just use whatever cropped up then in that sample. We didn't go through and select. And like we would probably say that our interest when it comes to these systems is more kind of at the level of the platform than at the kind of level of the specific image or the video. Understanding these platforms and architectures as systems that kind of shape what remembering kind of looks like. We're kind of, interested at that level. So whether it's genealogy platforms or Deathbot platforms or social media platforms, what they're doing in kind of transforming static materials into kind of animated, interactive artifacts is what kind of, interests us. But there are some kind of very specific moments or posts from the sample that kind of really stood out for us. So, for example, there's one we talk about all of the time from the Deep Nostalgia sample, where we had one tweet with a user posting an image, a kind of reanimation of a photo of their grandfather. And so their grandfather had died before they were born. In fact, they said he had died at the hands of another. So I guess we can assume that he had been killed. And so he died before this person had been born. And what they had done is they reanimated this photo so that they could see this person smiling and moving. And they had found that incredibly moving. And they'd shared this kind of quite emotional response to doing that. And we just thought that was so interesting because this person, now has a memory of this person smiling that they never saw smile in their lifetime. But it's complicated because it's not really that person smiling because it's powered by this driver video of somebody else smiling. So it's kind of like mashing up these kind of, we talk about data bodies quite a lot in our project. So it's this kind of coming together of these data bodies. So it's that other person's smile. And so what kind of a kind of connection to the past is that? What kind of an emotional resource does this thing become? What kind of a memory does that constitute? If it's a false memory, does it matter that it's a false memory? And if it does matter, why does it matter? And so these were all the kind of questions that were of interest to us. And that person's response to that photo isn't a kind of misunderstanding of the photo or a reading of it that is confused or anything like that. It's a response to the kind of logic that's in the architecture, that's in the design of the system, and in the way that thing is processed. And that then brings us back to platforms again. So kind of, encourages us to ask questions of the platform and what it is that the platform is trying to do there. So that's kind of long-winded, quite circular answer to your question there.
I feel like there is so many layers in that one example already, because the smiling deceased grandfather, it's kind of like a fake memory, but then you're like, okay, but this person was probably happy when they saw it. But then it's still in a way problematic because of the platform and how they use the data. And I feel like there is so much philosophical stuff that you could discuss about here, right?
Yeah. And we talk a lot about our own kind of emotional reaction to these technologies. And so, for example, Ava's reticence to kind of, do this work of revival when it comes to her grandmother, that of course has emotional dimensions, her reticence to do that. And we talk a lot about what happens if we do something in this kind of space of revival that we can't undo, that we find problematic for some reason. It changes how we remember somebody, it changes maybe how we relate to them, and we can't unsee it or unfeel the feelings associated with it. We can't forget it. So yeah, it's very knotty, as you suggest.
And you also mentioned that some people did not only like resurrect their own ancestors, but also public figures, famous actors, singers, etc. And when I read about this, I immediately had to think of these ABBA holograms in London, I think, right? So there's this concert that you can visit by ABBA, but it's not the actual ABBA, it's just holograms of them, but they're younger selves, basically. And I mean, there's this whole trend in society of always wanting to be perceived as youthful, and I had to think of the film The Substance as well. And so I just thought, if we take this to the extremes, like, will it be a trend at some point that people just use avatars of their younger selves for like anything? Like, for example, would I send my younger self to this interview right now instead of my actual self? Is that something you can imagine happening with this tool?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we do see a lot of that, don't we? This kind of trend for people recreating versions of their younger self. So there was another one that we've talked about quite recently, that was interesting, was that kind of trend where people were using AI to create images where they, as an older person, were putting their arm around or hugging their younger self.
Oh wow!
Was kind of quite creepy looking. And another recent example that certainly I think is interesting is Katie Price. I don't know if you know her. She's a UK model and celebrity who has recently launched this kind of conversational bot of her younger self, so that people can pay to interact with her. So yeah, these kind of younger and the avatars of they call the avatars, which I think is great, of ABBA Voyage. It's a real kind of good example of how kind of productive these versions of ourselves can be, perhaps more productive than our own selves, and that of course then is interesting in terms of the commercial piece. So yes, we see that a lot with celebrities, that desire to create a younger self. We did a bit of work where we were looking at 9 case studies of kind of high profile actors, celebrities, singers who were being kind of revived. And very often, of course, the decision was made to revive them posthumously, but as a much younger person. And so, there's this kind of desire to kind of live, as it were, outside of time and outside of the kind of limits of the body and outside of biology. And some people have been researching all of that. There's some great work around the avatars, and all of that is very interesting to us. Yeah,
kind of a scary trend, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Now, the main topic of your presentation in Prague was also equally interesting and scary. I think everybody was super fascinated during your presentation, but people were also like, oh wow, this is a thing. Because you talked about so-called deathbots. And so that's basically AI avatars of people who already passed away. And so you talked about several websites that offer the creation of these AI avatars, of these deathbots. And these websites are usually based on subscription models. Now, you tried to do that yourselves, right? You created avatars of yourself, basically pre-mortem avatars. And I just wanted to ask you, how was that? What did that feel like?
Yeah, it's super creepy, clearly. Yeah, so so we used a number of different systems. We used four different systems, four different platforms, some of which were kind of designed for people to use pre-mortem. So the idea is that you kind of archive your own life so that people can access your memories, after you have passed away. So you leave it as a kind of legacy for your loved ones, and they can access it as a kind of an interactive archive. So they can ask you to tell stories about, or ask the system to pull up stories about when you were a child, or about what your family life was like, or about your maiden name, or whatever it might be. So we were using those as kind of pre-mortem systems, and then we used another couple of systems that were designed for people to interact with you, so that the user is not you as somebody pre-mortem, but the user is somebody post-mortem trying to kind of connect with somebody after they have passed away. And so they are then uploading that data and creating the system. So yes, it was all very weird. It was equally unsettling and fascinating, all at the same time. Some of those systems, and of course, we're coming at this with an interest in memory and an interest in platforms. And some of those platforms were interested in kind of preserving memory, kind of, intact. So, as I say, kind of, it would kind of talk you through as a user, recording and storing your own personal stories, which you would organize then by theme and all of the rest of it. And those other systems were much more kind of, generative. So you upload data about a deceased person, so their messages, their social media posts, voice samples, for example, and then the system will build a kind of chatbot that can kind of notionally at least kind of respond in the tone of the person and the style of their communications. And of course, those use a kind of subset of AI machine learning, which, ideally then kind of improves through practice. And so what we found was that the AI are very good at kind of, helping to preserve stories, helping to preserve voices, but they are very bad at, in the examples we looked at, and certainly currently, kind of replicating the complexity of a person or of a relationship. So the synthetic afterlives that we were creating were largely pretty weird. They were wholly kind of insincere. They were very clunky, quite glitchy. And they kind of remind us, of course, that memory is something that is kind of, relational and contextual and, not programmable in that kind of a way. So yeah, they were interesting to explore, but they were really kind of a way of kind of, reminding us actually of the importance, I think, of finality and of loss and forgetting and all of the rest of it when it comes to death, and when it comes to remembering healthily, where you get these systems where the dead are always kind of present, always interactive, always being updated. It raises questions about how helpful that is, how desirable it is, about what kind of trickery that is, and about how those sorts of systems might be exploited going forward. So a lot of what we experienced made us feel quite kind of uneasy, I guess, about what is kind of going on in this space, especially where you have people who are using systems who might be considered vulnerable, or who are grieving. Of course, we were not grieving as we were, creating these deathbots, and there's been very little research done into how people who might be vulnerable or who might be grieving find using these systems. So there's a lot we don't know about them.
Yeah, you actually already partially answered my next question, because I wondered how good are these AI doppelgangers? Because I thought, okay, if people have to upload photos and videos of themselves, won't they choose, for example, photos where they are particularly happy and good looking? Isn't that a way to influence your own commemoration pre-mortem?
Yeah, I mean, And so what you're doing really is you're kind of curating a version of yourself
Yeah.
that you're kind of, happy to leave behind, and that then is going to kind of exist, outside of time in the way that we were saying. And as you're making this deathbot, this interactant, whatever you want to call it, we call them deathbots, other people call them thanabots or deadbots. There are lots of different terms for them. But as you're making it, you're super aware of the person that you're making it for. So you're editing and you're telling stories on the basis of who that kind of imagined audience is. And making one bot is not enough, because you make one bot for one person, but then you might make a very different bot for another person. So the bot I leave for my, this sounds kind of awful, but the bot I would leave for my child might be different to the bot I would leave for my partner. And it might be built on different data sets, or it might need to be built on different data sets if it's going to be in any way kind of, genuine or feel authentic to the experience, or, feel like a kind of coherent version of me to the person. So there's a lot of work to do in the kind of constructing of these things in order to make them work for those people that we are going to be leaving them for. And that's before you even get to the bit about, thinking about how useful this thing is actually going to be for the person that we're leaving it for, how likely they might be to actually interact with it, or whether we're just leaving them with a very expensive, paid subscription that they feel too guilty to cancel. There's a lot of that kind of emotional editing that goes on in creating these things.
I see. At the conference, you also talked about a specific website where you can basically upload chats that you had with a deceased person, and then you can continue texting with that person, and they basically reply to you. I mean, the AI avatar replies to you in the way that this person would. Do you happen to know which large language model this is based on? Is it basically the same as like ChatGPT, for example? Does it work that way?
I don't know. I could probably find that out if I went. So Ava produced this wonderful table, which is in the publication that we did about the Deathbots, which I think probably goes into the detail of which of the LLMs they're kind of built on. So I won't hazard a guess, but I could probably follow up with that. But invariably they're not using their own systems. They're kind of building on top of one of those existing models, which then raises all of the questions about bias and all the rest of it that might exist in the training data, which is also interesting when it comes to thinking about different cultures and different societies and how they remember and how they think about death and all of the rest of it. The assumptions in the data, the training data, become kind of consequential when it comes to thinking about those sorts of things as well.
I also wanted to ask a kind of specific question, because I recently watched a documentary about so-called AI girlfriends and AI boyfriends, which are also based on large language models. And so what the reporter basically found out is that these girlfriends and boyfriends always answer to their partners in a way that makes them feel good. It's always like, oh yeah, I appreciate the relationship we have, I appreciate the connection we share, whatever. And there's basically no way to argue with them about anything. And then I wondered, if you create this AI avatar of a person that you actually knew in real life, who was maybe your friend or your family member, would they be the same way? Because, for example, I thought of, making an avatar of somebody who might be vegan, for example, and then you start an argument with them about eating meat. Would they actually fight back because that is how the person would have reacted? Or would they just be the same as these AI girlfriends and boyfriends and be like, oh yeah, you're right, that's a good opinion that you have there?
Yeah. You're so clever. Yes. They do like to kind of tell us how clever and interesting we are.
Yeah.
We found that a bit with our Deathbots. Everything is very kind of generic. They don't want to say anything that they think is going to upset you. That's a result of the kind of the systems themselves. So algorithms, of course, work best at a kind of degree of abstraction. So when you're designing these sorts of systems, you're going to exclude kind of atypical or chaotic inputs. You want to produce a system that is going to be quite predictable, quite persuasive in its outputs. So that kind of, channels these things towards being quite uniform, towards conformity and how they kind of do this work of revival. The data that you upload to these systems is in quite superficial ways kind of visible in the responses that you get. So, for example, if you upload social media data that's full of emoji, you're going to get responses that are full of emoji. If you upload data that is much more kind of serious, in tone, you're going to get more serious kind of responses back. So again, I think it would depend very much on the data that you uploaded and how kind of specific and authentic to how that person would communicate that kind of that data might be. The more data that you upload, I guess, the more like a person's communication the bot might assume. But yeah, we tended to find though that these systems, they would kind of steer away from topics that might be considered contentious. I don't know about your meat eating example. Maybe that's not quite contentious enough, but certainly they want to talk about how they died. That's those sorts of things they absolutely don't want to talk about. And they do things like kind of slip between first and third person in a way that is not very convincing. It's not very human. Quite kind of glitchy. So yeah, I don't know. The systems they're engineered for engagement in the end. They're engineered for this kind of effective appeal. They're not designed to, they're not particularly interested in fidelity to facts. So they will kind of, hallucinate memories and, all the rest of it. Then they're not particularly committed to faithfully reproducing your experiences of childhood or the holidays you went on as a family or any of that kind of stuff. What they're interested in is your kind of continued interaction, not necessarily accuracy. I mean, it's an industry in the end.
Okay. So
What it's going to do, this system, this Deathbot, is going to kind of tell you a story or communicate with you in a way that it thinks is best designed to give you the experience, the feelings that you want to feel. That's what it's going to do in the end.
So if they hallucinate memories, could you, for example, tell them, "Oh, do you remember the time we went to Edinburgh?" And then even if that never happened, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, we visited the castle. It was beautiful."
Yeah, sure,
Oh, wow.
yeah. And spontaneously it will also, some of the systems we used would hallucinate memories. I mean, not even, you don't have to prompt them to do that. They'll talk to you, "Oh, remember the time we did this?" And if you say to it, "We never did that," it'll say, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." I sometimes get a little bit confused, and so yeah, it's yeah. But what was very weird was when it would do, because on occasion it would hallucinate something that you hadn't told it, but actually was quite kind of faithful to what might have happened in your past. That's very weird.
That sounds creepy.
Yeah, it does get a bit creepy. Yeah, but largely what we found was that there's a kind of a flattening of memories here, and of course distortion in those processes as well.
All right. Now, we already kind of touched upon the subject of these models being based on subscriptions, and this is obviously quite problematic. And I wondered, how high is the potential of addiction from that? Because when I imagine that somebody loses a person who was very close to them, how much time would they spend on these Deathbots? Like, are there any statistics that tell us how long on average people use these platforms?
So we don't know enough about how people use these platforms. There aren't really any study. There are some going on at the moment, but there aren't any published studies at the moment of people who've been using these systems, and certainly not for any length of time. So whether it kind of alleviates or exacerbates grief, that's still a kind of open question. We need to understand all of that a bit better. There have been some suggestions that using these kinds of systems or these Deathbots within therapeutic contexts might be quite kind of useful. So you would be able to kind of very much manage the ways in which and the extent of time that people invested in these systems. Again, we don't really understand or know enough about how they work even in those sorts of contexts. I guess what concerns us is that these interactions are often kind of presented as being kind of benign or perhaps even therapeutic, while the kind of underlying processes remain, for most people, very opaque. We've had to work quite hard to begin to understand what's going on kind of beneath the surface. There's this risk that kind of conversational simulations kind of flatten people into kind of smoother, more compliant or more platform friendly versions of themselves. And that might be quite comforting, for some people. Maybe it would encourage people to come back, over time. But yeah, that could, of course, in time be quite, emotionally destabilizing. But yeah, we don't really know enough about what those long-term impacts might look like.
Yeah, I feel it might also be quite subjective. I feel like it could help some people. It might be re-traumatizing for others. I think I wouldn't really have that big of an issue with it if it was for free, but I feel like since these companies kind of profit from it, I feel like they're just profiting from people's grief, and that's what makes it so problematic, in my opinion.
Yeah, and they want you to, or the person to continue engaging for as long as possible.
Yeah.
So they're not particularly interested in kind of, resolving issues and, closing the system down after a certain amount of time. Yeah.
And then you also get the kind of compounded issue of what happens when the companies go down.
Yeah.
What happens if they go bust or they close? The data is then gone with them. And then there's been examples of people that have like uploaded their data. They know that they're going to pass away in a certain amount of time, so they upload their data. They give the login information or whatever it is to their loved ones, who then, a period of time after that person's died, they go and try to log on to access it, and they can't.
That's terrible.
So it's, and there doesn't seem to be anything in place at the moment to kind of counteract that.
Yeah.
Or to kind of put checks and balances in place for it.
Do you know if any of these companies has gone bankrupt so far?
So there are quite a lot of these systems that have closed down.
Yeah.
So I don't know on what basis, whether they've gone bankrupt or what. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these companies have kind of struggled to maintain this business model over time, or to find a kind of consistent user base. So that is a concern then, given that promise about continuance and continuity and remembrance over time.
Actually, one of the things you talked about in your presentation, which shocked me the most, was AI deepfakes of true crime victims. You used the example of James Bulger, who was a kid who was murdered in the UK in the 1990s, I think, right? And I got goosebumps when you talked about this, because I found it so terrible that people used an AI avatar of this kid on social media, who was then basically telling the story of what happened to this child. And I had never really seen this before in any way, but then recently I was on TikTok and I saw a video of a German girl who was actually murdered in Germany in the 1990s as well. And I just thought, how in the world is this legal? Doesn't the family have any rights to like pursue a lawsuit against the person who uploads these things?
It's a really difficult one. So there's another example which I came across when I was scrolling through my TikTok. So they were two schoolgirls called Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, and they were killed by their school caretaker in the early 2000s in the UK. And there was a photograph that had been taken of them. They were both Manchester United fans. And that photo of them in their football shirts was circulated in the media because they were seen as missing children before they were discovered. They were missing for a period of time. So that photo was circulated. And then last year that cropped up on my TikTok feed, having been animated through something like Deep Nostalgia. And it started off with them saying, "We are Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, and this is part one of our story." Now, it's tricky, and I've spoken to one of the journalists who was involved in the case in the very beginning, and the parents have been trying to get that photo out of circulation for quite a while, apparently. But it's difficult because once it's out there, it's out there. They'd given that permission in the first place for it to circulate in kind of press, newspapers, as it was at the time. But once it exists, and that's even more accurate now with the internet, it's really difficult to bring it back in. And you'll also find that the accounts that tend to be sharing this kind of content aren't usually based in the US or the UK. It's very difficult to find out who owns the accounts and who's sharing that kind of content. So TikTok can kind of ban them, but trying to find out who they are to start a lawsuit or something against them is very, very difficult to do. That question, I jumped to mind when Jen was talking about kind of celebrities, because Robin Williams has explicitly said before he passed away that he did not want his likeness to be used in this context. People are still animating Robin Williams, and some of them then send those animations to his daughter, who says very clearly, my dad did not want this. So trying to police it is really, really hard. I know, so James Bulger's mother is trying to go through the UK courts to like prevent this stuff from happening. But then you also get not just the kind of animated photographs, but deep fake videos created through like Midjourney or DALL-E, which are of a more kind of illustration style, or like more of like a graphic or a cartoon style rather than photorealistic. So then, and I've looked at quite a few with those, and the description will be, this is based on a likeness of the victim, not the actual person. We're doing this to raise awareness. And they don't necessarily give names. They just say things like, I was killed in 2003 by, I won't go into like specific details, but it'll go through that so you can find out easily who it is, but it's not like a true representation in the deepfake.
I feel like there is a need for like a whole new set of regulations on this. Maybe this will happen the next couple of years. I mean, I hope so personally.
I hope so, but I also feel like we're trying to close the stable door after the horses bolted a little bit. Like this stuff is out there already, and they're kind of running to catch up. And I wonder how successful we'll be.
You also talked about an example of a murder victim who addressed the person who killed him in court. If I remember correctly, that was in the United States, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And the person who made that video was actually his sister, and she said that it was part of her healing process. And I just wondered, will this become normal in the next couple of years? Like, will this be part of trials in court? Can you imagine this?
Yes, I can. And there's a lot of discussion about it. So it's Chris Pelkey was the victim. He was killed in a road rage incident, coming up, I guess, to 4 years ago now. So the trial took place in the US last year, and Chris's sister and other family members created basically a deep fake. So it's a video of Chris addressing his killer in court. The script was written by his sister, and then it was kind of fed into software which emulated Chris's voice, and then attached it to this video of him talking. And what was both interesting and concerning was the judge's reaction to it. So the prosecution were pushing for a sentence of 9 years. The killer was actually sentenced for 10.5, which is what the family had been pushing for. And the judge said things like, I can hear the forgiveness in that video. I believe it was genuine. And I find that, and others do as well, find that really concerning, because it is not the victim speaking.
Of course, it's not real.
It will never be the victim speaking.
Yeah.
So I'm concerned about, okay, should that be given any kind of weight in the court system? You can hear the impact from the family who are still there and who still exist and are real. But beyond the fact that the victim is dead, you're not going to know what that impact is, and you're not going to know how they would respond to their murder. So Chris's sister said something like, we know he would have wanted forgiveness. We know in another life you guys would have been friends, blah, blah, blah. But you can't know that. You can think you know as much as you do about a person, but when something like that happens, you never truly know how they're going to react. So the concern is, when we give weight to that as part of an impact statement in a judicial context, not just for healing for the family, it raises a whole other set of ethical questions.
Yeah. I find it quite concerning that this already influences lawsuits and like the way in which people have to face consequences for their actions. Yeah, particularly when we start thinking about who the victims are versus who the accused are, because we start getting into things like racial bias and gender bias and class bias and all of that sort of stuff. And that it just kind of adds on to the biases that we already see in things like AI usage. All of these examples we've talked about of people being revived with AI kind of remind me of this concept of the multiverse that came up in like the Marvel movies in the last couple of years, where basically, okay, if one character dies in one universe, we can still make a film about them that takes place in another universe. And I just wondered, will Deathbots kind of have an impact on what we or how we perceive death? Like, will death at least in some way lose part of its meaning?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
I guess one of the things, and this isn't really going to be an answer at all, but guess one of the things to think about is we are considering Deathbots through a particularly Western lens. And there are obviously a lot of other cultures that approach death and deal with death in very different ways. So they may not be impacted by Deathbots at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, that's not necessarily an answer to the question.
It's a good reminder, I think, though, that people obviously approach death in very different ways, but they also approach media in different ways and have used media as a way to mourn for a very long time. So, from the 19th century, you had post-mortem photography where people would take an image to keep of a loved one who had died. Home video, voicemail has, preserved voices and gestures, things like that. And these practices, have often been very kind of intimate and family-led. But I guess what feels different now to us is the kind of scale here. And the business models, then they're also kind of associated with them, and their kind of extractive and exploitative tendencies, as we have emphasized. But then at the same time, I do think that these particular kinds of trends, the deathbots, that certainly the ones that I've been playing around with, I suspect that we'll see those kind of tools and trends take off as kind of generalized consumer technologies, quite slowly. I kind of think, in terms of our own personal uses of digital data to create AI afterlives, the disruptive potential of these tools is probably overplayed by the industries that, create them. They're trying to sell us a product in the end. As we noted, some of these services have already kind of, fallen over. They've struggled to find a user base. I mean, Deep Nostalgia really was quite a one-off in terms of its kind of explosive virality at the time, and that kind of very broad appeal. And I think there's probably good reason why these things don't tend to kind of really, or haven't tended to kind of take off. Certainly on the Deathbot side of things that I've been exploring. And as Bethan's already alluded to, there's a lot of kind of quite established rituals and norms and values around death and grieving and practices of mourning and remembering, and all of that I think is going to be quite difficult to disrupt. And as we said, a lot of these systems, kind of fail within the first couple of years, suggesting that the appetite to kind of really do things differently is not yet widespread. I guess that might be a bit, I'd be interested in kind of Bethan's thoughts in relation to the true crime context, because it does seem to me that is a bit more of a kind of wild west of the internet when it comes to these sorts of practices. But what interested me about your question as well is that it kind of starts to get at some of the claims that are made about kind of digital immortality, and we hear this term immortality used quite a lot in relation to the digital. And although we're not so interested in kind of situating these practices in relation to immortality in a kind of metaphorical sense, in the infrastructural sense, that's quite an interesting kind of concept. So these platforms, they're not delivering eternal life, but they do enable us to kind of persist as modifiable, monetizable data, which is sustained through algorithms, corporate ownership, ongoing user interaction, and all the rest of it. And in that sense, that kind of notion of infrastructural immortality is quite kind of, significant and potentially consequential, and something we kind of need to keep an eye on. But I don't know whether you want to say anything more about the true crime context.
Yeah. The other things we talked obviously about murder victims, but what we are also seeing is the revival of serial killers. using true crime?
Oof, oh my God.
Yeah. So,
It just
and
gets weirder.
it does, it really does. These tend to be more of the kind of like illustrative, like graphic animation style with Midjourney and things like that, rather than the photorealistic stuff or the reanimation of photographs. But you will see things like I don't know, Ed Gein sitting on a bed in a prison cell saying, I'm Ed Gein and I'm the most notorious killer in the United
Mm.
States and things like that. And then I gotta admit I've scrolled off them very quickly because I'm a bit like I don't really know if I want to watch this. So I think we'll keep seeing that. Which in itself is quite interesting because there's so much written about serial killers. Like we don't really need another form of media that's giving us their voices. I could kind of see, and thinking about the Netflix Gabby Petito documentary that was released last year, they used AI to recreate Gabby's voice.
Really?
Yeah, and it was done with the parents' kind of permission and collaboration. So there are segments in the documentary where we see diary extracts on screen, and then Gabby reads them, and that was created using AI. And the family had kind of given the producers, production company, like video recordings, audio recordings, access to the diaries and stuff like that, so that they could get a true, and I'm using a lot of quotation marks, they could get like a true representation of Gabby's voice. And I know parents kind of spoke about how strange it was to hear her, knowing that it wasn't her, kind of really her. So there's a potential argument that AI could be used to give victims an alternative voice, and we kind of see that with the Chris Pelkey case as well. But I'm like, why do we need to give killers a voice? Like there's so much focus on them already. So that's interesting. And like I said, I think I could see that continuing. And I wonder whether there's something there about kind of respect for the victims. We shouldn't be reviving them using AI because it's not respectful. Whereas actually, we don't really care if killers are revived because they did horrible things in the first place. So there's something around that, I think. What is also really interesting, and there's been some work done on this, not a lot, is the use of AI to kind of revive or let you experience life as a Holocaust victim.
Oh God.
Yeah. You think it can't get worse, and
It
then
gets more
worse.
terrible each time you mention something new.
Yeah. So there's been work done on I think it's the Forever Young project, which has done videos with kind of Holocaust survivors, but then used AI to kind of show their younger selves. And the idea was that young people couldn't connect with older Holocaust survivors, so we should see them as their young selves, which I disagree with, but I digress. But so there's kind of been work done on that, and there's work done around the question of using AI for survivor stories. And there's an exhibition called New Dimensions in Testimony where you can interact with holograms of Holocaust survivors and ask them questions, and the LLM kind of pulls the answer from a database of interview responses they gave years ago. But I think we're seeing that as well, so you can kind of experience a day in the life at Auschwitz through AI videos on TikTok. And yeah, so it starts getting quite disturbing, and like a lot of these accounts kind of talk about it as an educational thing. So some of the true crime videos talk about, oh, we're doing this because we don't want it to ever happen to anybody else again, and that's a really weak argument because these things are always happening and will always happen. So creating an AI video of the victim telling their story isn't going to do anything except potentially get you more followers and more engagement, and therefore more money if you're on the TikTok creator account. So yeah, I mean, true crime as a genre, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It sort of took off in sort of like 2014, 2015, and it seems to be just kind of on an ascendance. And I don't know, the fact that we can now do all this kind of stuff with AI, I feel like that might just keep happening because it's a very kind of current entertainment space. And there's whole issues there about, crime and entertainment and murder and entertainment, which kind of sitting almost apart from the AI and crime and entertainment connection.
Mm. I feel like especially when it comes to the Holocaust, there is really a danger of especially younger people believing things that are just historically inaccurate. I recently watched a video about this book called The Boy with the Striped Pajama, and I
Yes.
never read it, but apparently there were some surveys among kids who had to read this book in school, and then they really had some wrong assumptions about the
Mm.
Holocaust. And I feel
Yeah.
like TikTok videos about this topic might make it even worse.
Yeah. Especially if you start kind of creating the photorealistic stuff, the stuff that's very obviously not kind of an illustration or something like that.
Yeah.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because there's always this want to kind of be where people are. So, if TikTok isn't the right place to do Holocaust education, I'm not suggesting that it is, but where is the best place to do that?
Right.
And what does that look like going forward? And these are all the questions that institutions and organizations are having to tussle with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just thinking as you were speaking there, Bethan, that all of that raises, I think, all those different kind of contexts raise really interesting questions about kind of whose data remains, retain value after they die, whether that's commercial value or emotional value or historical value. And those questions are going to become all the more pertinent, really.
I feel like there are so many directions you could go in with a synthetic past project. But do you actually already know for how long you will be working on this and what will be your next steps?
So we should say that the project is currently funded by the Leverhulme Trust here in the UK, and that will take us up until August this year. So we're at the moment trying to work through our analysis of a whole bunch of interviews. We've been doing Bethan's been doing lots of interviews with different people who are variously kind of invested in these technologies. We're also doing some creative work. We want to make a film over the coming months.
Ooh.
And we've got a book coming out in the summer called AI Afterlives, which is with Bloomsbury. So we've got a number of things happening over the coming months, and then we'll be looking to try and secure some more funding to take the project forward.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, as you say, there's lots to think about, lots to do.
Definitely. Yeah. I'm excited about your book coming out. I will definitely read it.
Yeah, great. We'll keep you posted.
Sure. Are there any other projects you're currently working on that you want to share something about?
Do you want to, Bethan? Do you want to talk a little bit about you? Bethan's always doing lots of different things.
I'm always doing things. So I'm currently doing some work on dark tourism. So I know like when we first started chatting, Laura, I was talking about fan studies being kind of my background more than the sort of heritage stuff. And I did a lot of work on anti-fandom and toxic fandom and hatred online and all of that sort of stuff. And I've moved into looking at what I'm calling dark fandom now. So interest in things like serial killers and school shooters and dark tourism. So I'm working on a book chapter about dark tourism and rituals online. So like I'm looking specifically at Columbine, so visits to Columbine High School, and then discussions and sharing of photographs and stuff online as a form of kind of ritual memorial and thinking about who's allowed to be remembered. So obviously they were the victims of the shooting, but then Eric Harrison Dylan Klebold also died at the shooting, and remembrances of them are kind of frowned upon and criticised. So I'm kind of interested in things around like that sort of thing. So who's allowed to be remembered? Kind of relating to what you said, Jen, about the kind of digital afterlives. So I'm working on that. I'm working on trying to think what else am I working on, Jen? We've got a couple of conferences coming up, so I'm going to be exploring the AI true crime stuff in more detail because that's fascinating. So I'm doing a lot of true crime and dark fandom stuff at the moment.
And the serial killers bit is a bit intense for me. So, I'll maybe mention some work that we've been doing with museums and heritage sites, which Bethan obviously has been involved with as well. So as you mentioned with Dimensions and Testimony, museums and heritage sites are increasingly thinking about kind of what we've been calling AI afterlives. as well, thinking about revival of, historic persons and all the rest of it. And so we did a bit of work with cultural professionals. We did some workshops, and we've come up with some resources for them if they're working in this area. So we've got a workbook which is available on the website, the Responsible AI Afterlives workbook. And we're also hoping to do some training as well in the coming months. So again, that should keep us busy.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Now, I already mentioned that your Synthetic Past project has its own website. Are there any other channels where we can follow your work? Do you have personal websites or social media channels that you want to share?
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. So my handle there is memorieschild dot bsky.social, I think. But yeah, that's where I am. And I've got a personal website which I very infrequently update, which is just bethanvjones.wordpress.com. But yeah, those are kind of the main places I can be found online.
Yeah, there's the Synthetic Past project website, as you say. And then for me, I guess it would just be my university webpage. So that's easy enough to find. And then, ghastly as it is to say, I'm also on LinkedIn, which seems to have become the kind of place of choice for people in recent months.
Yeah.
I'm still kind of adjusting to that.
Oh, I feel like that's the place where people are like, on the weekend I proposed to my girlfriend. These are 10 things you can learn for your business about this.
Yeah. Weird juxtapositions of things. But as you probably established, we quite like weird just juxtapositions of things.
All right. So that was basically my last question. This was a super interesting, fun interview. Thank you so much for being guests on my podcast.
Oh, thank you for asking us.
Yeah, thank you for your brilliant questions.
Oh, thank you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about Deathbots in the future. I'm scared as well. I'm also super interested. I feel like everybody who listened to your presentation in Prague was.
We haven't even asked you whether you would make one.
On myself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a mixture of skepticism and curiosity for me, and I feel like at the end curiosity would probably win. So I'm kind of leaning more towards yes. I don't know. I might regret it later.
You'll have to let us know if you do.
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
All right, then. Thank you so much.
Down the rabbit hole, research rabbit holes.